up this forest.
I watched Silent Running at an outdoor cinema when I was only 5 years old. I still remember the sadness I felt for the fate of the animals inside the domes that were destroyed, the poor Huey after being run over by Lowell, and the scene of the robot Dewey quietly watering plants in the endless void of space. All of that made me choke up when I walked out of the theatre, and that feeling remains intact every time I rewatch this film. But the deeper I explored the behind the scenes, the more strange details I discovered that I never noticed when I was young. Did you know that Bruce Dern almost collapsed from heat shock in the spacewalk suit? Or that the robots were actually played by real leg amputee actors? And that the Nixon administration once had the FBI investigate the film because of a ridiculous suspicion? Those stories are not only secrets, but also pieces that make up a film ahead of its time. And today, we will unveil the secrets behind the movie Silent Running 20. The spacewalk scene almost made Bruce Dern collapse from heat shock. When re-watching Silent Running after many years, I was always haunted by the scenes of Freeman Lowell floating in space, where everything was almost motionless, no explanatory dialogue, only a small human drifting through vast emptiness. And only much later did I learn that such silence was exchanged for a physically dangerous challenge for Bruce Dern. The spacesuit he wore in the spacewalk scenes looked modern and airtight on screen, but in reality, it was only multiple layers of thick material pressed tightly against the body, with no ventilation or cooling system, causing heat from the studio lights to accumulate quickly, especially when Dern had to be suspended by cables for hours to maintain the correct position for the camera. His body began to suffer heat shock, sweat poured like a bath, his heart pounded, his vision blurred from the heat. Medics on set repeatedly demanded a stop, fearing he could faint or worse. But Dern clenched his teeth and refused, insisting on filming until the end. He told Trumbull that if they stopped, the real feeling would be lost. And he needed to maintain that physical pain so Lowell would become authentic. They kept filming without cutting until Dern was nearly exhausted. When they removed his helmet, his face was flushed red. He was gasping for air, but his eyes remained cold and sharp. It was that silent endurance that made the spacewalk scene not just a visual effects sequence, but a moment of a real human confronting absolute isolation. 19. Filming on a real aircraft carrier. Few people know that behind the cold, solitary images of Silent Running was a real aircraft carrier, the USS Valley Forge, an Essex-class ship that had served in Vietnam, now rented at a surprisingly low price to serve as the main setting. Universal Studios chose it because of low cost and its massive size, which suited Trumbull's Flying Eden concept. But no one anticipated the harsh reality the crew would have to face. The ship had no air conditioning, no heating, only a hollow block of metal after years of retirement. In the summer of 1971, the temperature inside exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit, over 38 degrees Celsius, the air suffocating like a furnace. Real trees were planted in compartments to film the forest scenes, but they wilted quickly, leaves drooping, resin melting under the filming lights. Actors and crew were drenched in sweat, clothes sticking to their bodies, some suffering heat stroke and needing to lie down for long rests. In winter, when filming continued, the metal was cold to the bone. Breath turned into white mist in the air. Hands operating, the camera became stiff. The sound of metal contracting and expanding crackled throughout day and night, like the groan of a world slowly dying. 18. Harsh weather during filming caused the film crew to panic. Did you know that in order to obtain scenes so harsh and realistic that they made viewers shiver in Silent Running, the film crew had to face weather that was truly like an invisible enemy aboard the USS Valley Forge? In the summer of 1971, the temperature inside the ship's compartments exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit, the air suffocating like a giant furnace. High-power filming lights continuously illuminated the artificial forest, causing real tree resin to melt into drops, giving off a light, burnt smell. Plants wilted after only a few hours, leaves drooping as if about to die. The film crew was drenched in sweat, clothes soaked. Several people suffered from severe heat stroke to the point of fainting right on set. They had to be carried out into fresh air and given fluids on the spot. There was no air conditioning, no fans, everything relied only on endurance. When winter came, as they continued filming interior scenes, the ship's metal was cold to the bone. People's breath condensed into white mist right before their faces. Camera operators' hands became stiff, fingers numb to the point it was difficult to press a button. The sound of metal contracting and expanding cracked throughout day and night, echoing like the groan of a dying creature. That sound was not an effect. It was real, seeping into every frame, making Freeman Lowell's sense of isolation and despair more vivid than ever. 17. The spaceship explosion scene used real explosives. I still remember vividly the explosion of the ship Valhalla in Silent Running. The moment the ship broke apart in the dark void of space, flames bursting fiercely then extinguishing, leaving a deadly silence that weighed heavily on the soul. It was not post-production effects or a miniature model, but an actual explosion executed only once. Douglas Trumbull decided to use real explosives to achieve maximum realism, because at that time CGI was not capable of recreating such destructive power. The crew built a large-scale model of the ship, filling it with explosives at key points. Everything had to be perfect on the first attempt. If the explosion was wrong, the entire model would be lost. An enormous investment compared to the budget of only $1.3 million US. There was no backup shot, no plan B. The entire crew stood hundreds of meters away, holding their breath behind protective glass. The explosion thundered. Metal fragments flew in all directions in a blinding flash, black smoke billowing like a death cloud. Fortunately, it happened according to the script. The ship disintegrated exactly. Flames burned brightly, then faded, leaving fragments silently floating. Trumbull later said that moment made him tremble, not because of technique, but because it resembled the death of a world. 16. Freeman Lowell was written as an ecological extremist. You may not know that Trumbull deliberately constructed the protagonist as an ecological extremist, not a good or pleasant person. Lowell was willing to kill his crewmates to protect the last forests on the ship, even though such an act turned him into a criminal. There was no moment of redemption, no emotional apology, only cold determination to a frightening degree. Trumbull made it clear. He did not want the audience to love Lowell. He only wanted them to confront a difficult question. Is saving nature worth sacrificing human lives? That character reflected anxieties of the 1972 era, when the environmental movement was on the rise, but also criticised as extreme. Bruce Dern brought that depth by acting without begging for sympathy, making viewers both empathise and feel uneasy. Rewatching it, we realise Lowell was not a saviour. He was a warning about the thin line between idealism and fanaticism. It was precisely that complexity that made Silent Running exceed the boundaries of a normal science fiction film, becoming a story about human beings and unforgivable choices. 15. Douglas Trumbull had never directed a film before. It is hard to imagine that a film with such a strange and lonely rhythm as Silent Running was entrusted to someone who had never directed a feature film before, because at that time Douglas Trumbull was known only as a special effects genius, the man behind the revolutionary imagery of 2001, A Space Odyssey and The Andromeda Strain, not someone familiar with directing actors or constructing psychological depth. Universal considered the project a cheap gamble with a budget of only about $1.3 million US, and the studio leadership believed that technique and visual ideas could compensate for the lack of directing experience, something Trumbull himself was very aware of when he admitted that he did not know how to direct actors in a traditional way. Instead of intervening deeply, he relied heavily on cinematography, lighting and space, letting actors exist within the frame. bringing with them their own awkwardness and loneliness. Ironically, it was exactly that clumsiness that created the film's distinctive rhythm. 14. Silent running. Unexpectedly caught the attention of the Nixon administration. Surely, even if you are the biggest fan of silent running, you would never know that the film was once secretly monitored by the FBI under orders from the Nixon administration. In 1972, when the Clean Water Act had just been passed to control water pollution, Silent Running was released with a clear and sharp message. Major corporations were destroying Earth, and humans must act decisively, even extremely, to protect it. That message made White House aide Charles Colson, a powerful figure in Nixon's inner circle, feel uneasy. He requested that the FBI open a confidential investigation into Douglas Trumbull and the screenwriters, suspecting the film was disguised propaganda against corporate and governmental interests. Internal files concluded that Silent Running contained extreme environmental agitation, with potential negative influence on public opinion in a politically sensitive context. The investigation was only revealed after the Watergate scandal, when numerous classified documents were made public. Trumbull later recounted, with a mix of surprise and pride, that he did not expect a small film with a budget of only $1.3 million to attract attention from the White House to such a degree. 13. The robots were operated by disabled performers. Few would expect that the small, silent, and somewhat naive robots in Silent Running were created through people carrying far heavier stories than their appearances on screen. The four performers who played the robots, Huey, Dewey, and Louie, were all double amputees, selected from rehabilitation centres and veterans' hospitals, places that Hollywood rarely paid attention to at that time. They had to wear suits weighing nearly 20 kilograms, with almost no ventilation, while moving entirely with their hands, heads bent low, with their field of vision severely restricted. Each working session lasted only about 20 to 30 minutes, not because of privilege, but because their bodies could not endure longer in such conditions. There were no special arrangements, no private resting areas. They worked at the same pace as the entire crew, in the summer heat and winter cold aboard the ship. Strangely, it was precisely those physical limitations that gave the robots something mechanical props could never have: hesitation, slowness, and an imperfect quality that felt very human. 12. The poker scene, not in the script. We all burst out laughing when we saw the scene of humans and robots playing poker together, and we were all curious why the script had such an interesting scene. That idea was completely suggested by Bruce Dern during filming. One afternoon on the USS Valley Forge, when the crew was taking a break between heavy scenes, Dern looked at the actors in the robot suits and suddenly said to Trumbull, "Why doesn't Lowell teach them to play poker? They are his friends." Trumbull, who was looking for ways to make the relationship between Lowell and the robots closer, immediately agreed. With no time for elaborate preparation, they quickly set up a simple poker table from available props, took a real deck of poker cards, and started shooting that very afternoon. Dern taught the robots how to hold cards, arrange cards, and even bluff awkwardly. They shot only a few takes, with Dern sitting opposite Huey, Dewey, and Louie, playing and chatting casually, laughing like with real friends. The scene was not planned. There was no lengthy dialogue, but it became the emotional centre of the entire film. Lowell truly laughed for the first time, his eyes warm as he watched the robots lose so innocently. 11. The buried ending. During development, Douglas Trumbull wrote and tested 3 different versions of the ending, each carrying its own emotional tone. In the first ending, Lowell survives the explosion but is discovered by another crew like a wild animal. The robots, Huey, Dewey, Louie, are immediately destroyed. Lowell is taken back to Earth, now a dead planet, and ends up in a mental hospital, living in hallucinations about the lost forest. This was Trumbull's favourite version, pessimistic, haunting, emphasising the eternal isolation of humanity from nature. Trumbull loved ending 1 because it was ruthless, honest with the film's message. Saving nature with violence only leads to personal and social destruction. But Universal Studios firmly refused. They feared the audience would be too shocked and revenue would drop. They forced the current ending, Lowell's suicide, the drifting forest, leaving a more open aftertaste but still sad enough for the audience to reflect. On review, we understand why Trumbull regretted ending 1. It would have made Silent Running a much darker work, closer to the real environmental fears of that era. 10. The robot. Handing the wrench scene took 40 takes. The actors in the suits were completely inverted, lying face down, seeing nothing but a distorted space through a small glass slit. The distance between the robot's hand and Lowell's hand was only a few centimeters, but with limited vision and the heavy weight of the suit, just a 1 centimeter deviation would ruin the shot. The wrench would drop, or there would be unnatural contact. The crew had to shoot up to 40 times, each take lasting 20 to 30 minutes under the studio's high heat. The actors were sweating, hands shaking from exhaustion, but no one complained. After each failed attempt, they were helped out of the suit for a breath, then went right back. By the 40th time, when the wrench was handed over accurately and gently into Lowell's hand, the entire crew applauded and cheered. A rare moment of joy amid tough working days. Trumbull kept the scene as it was, with no editing to preserve that clumsy authenticity. When watching again, that simple gesture becomes strangely moving. Not a perfect special effect, but the real effort of a human inside the metal shell. 9. Joan Baez never met Trumbull. Every time I remember Silent Running, the first thing I recall is the voice of Joan Baez. Gentle, sad, like the final cry of earth. But few know that Joan Baez never met Douglas Trumbull. She only received a rough cut of the film, watched it alone in a dark room with no guidance or discussion. Then she sat down and wrote 2 songs in one go. Silent Running, Can't Let Go, and Rejoice in the Sun, as if bidding farewell to a dear friend slowly dying. Her warm, tormented voice seeped into every scene of the final forest, blending with Lowell's heavy breathing, creating a layer of emotion that no dialogue could replace. Trumbull wanted the music to be the soul of the planet, not just a background. Joan Baez immediately understood that. She left in every melody a silent pain, both desperate and gentle. Although the studio objected that it was too slow, too sad, Trumbull kept it as is. He knew that changing it would make the whole film lose its heart. 8. The studio hated the soundtrack from the beginning. Even though Joan Baez's music later won over audiences to the point of becoming an inseparable soul of Silent Running, initially Universal Studio absolutely hated it. When Trumbull screened the rough cut with the 2 songs Silent Running, Can't Let Go and Rejoice in the Sun, executives immediately protested fiercely. They said the music was too slow, too sad, too hippie, not suitable for a science fiction film that needed a fast, dramatic tempo to sell tickets. Some even suggested replacing it with majestic orchestral music or removing the soundtrack altogether to focus on the visuals and effects. Tensions rose to the point that Trumbull had to stand up and declare clearly, "Changing the music is killing the film. If you cut it, I'll leave the project immediately." That was a decisive moment as Trumbull was a first-time director with a tight budget and little power, but he resolutely defended his vision. The music had to be the planet's cry, not just decoration. In the end, the studio had to give in. Thanks to that decision, Joan Baez's 2 songs are not just a background, they become a lingering whisper, making viewers feel Earth's loss even more deeply. 7. The forest in the film was mostly fake. Perhaps the deepest impression in every Silent Running viewer's mind is the sight of the lush green forest floating in the cold space. A heartbreaking illusion of humanity's last nature, but few know that most of that forest was fake. Trunks made from foam, leaves from plastic and fabric, branches reinforced with wire and metal frames. The crew stacked them cleverly in layers, creating depth to fool the eye. From a distance, it looked like a real forest. Only up close did it reveal a bit of artificiality. To increase realism, Trumbull mixed in a few real trees for the close-up shots, making the leaves tremble slightly under the studio lights, casting soft shadows on the ship's floor. The construction process lasted for months, with hundreds of workers working non-stop under high temperatures. Each fake tree had to withstand intense lighting without melting or deforming. The result was a garden that looked unusually alive, so real that viewers believed life still had hope. Yet that very artificiality became a painful symbol. In a world that has lost all real nature, humans can only cling to fragile replicas. 6. Tree morgue, the green cemetery on the set. To create one of the most impressive scenes on screen at the time, dozens of real trees were rented by the day to shoot close-ups and detail shots of the forest on the ship. They were carefully tended at first, watered, placed under suitable light. But under high-powered studio lights and temperatures above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, the trees died quickly. Within 48 hours, the leaves yellowed, branches withered, roots dried up. The crew had to keep replacing them. Today the tree is lush, tomorrow it's a corpse, carried off to a hidden corner called the tree morgue, the green cemetery. The painful irony is here. A film calling for nature's protection unintentionally killed hundreds of real trees to create the image of the final forest. Trumbull never made this detail public, perhaps because he did not want to overshadow the main message. But that silent sacrifice became the strongest metaphor. To save imagined nature, humans are willing to sacrifice real nature. 5. The most iconic ending was not in the script. When the film was nearly completed, Douglas Trumbull felt that the current ending was not strong enough. He decided to film an additional scene that was not in the script. Dewey, the last remaining robot, quietly holding a watering hose for the tiny garden in the middle of endless space. The shot was unusually long, with no dialogue, no intense background music, only the sound of dripping water, faint mechanical noises, and the image of a small machine trying to sustain life in the cold universe. Trumbull kept the scene long enough for the audience to stay with it, forcing them to reflect instead of leaving the theatre immediately. That was a moment of fragile hope mixed with despair. Lowell was gone, but life was still being preserved by a robot, a symbol of what humanity left behind. The studio initially objected because they felt it was too slow, too sad, but Trumbull insisted on keeping it. When watching again, that scene became the most deeply imprinted image of the film. A tiny light in the vast darkness. A hopeless but deeply human act. Without it, silent running would end in tragedy. With it, the film leaves a faint glimmer that even if humanity fails, life still finds a way to continue. 4. The studio hated the ending. At first, the scene of Dewey watering the plants alone in space was considered too slow, too sad, too artistic, not commercially appealing enough for audiences to leave the theatre feeling satisfied. At first, executives suggested shortening or removing that unusually long shot, replacing it with a quicker ending, perhaps adding more obvious hope or some closing lines to make it easier to accept. Trumbull, who had filmed this scene himself without it being in the original script, immediately reacted strongly. He threatened to leave the film if it was cut, affirming that this ending was the heart of the entire work, a moment that forced the audience to stay and reflect on the fragility of life instead of leaving immediately. It was a tense confrontation between artistic vision and commercial interest. With a small budget and as a first-time director, Trumbull still won. The scene of Dewey quietly watering in the universe was kept, long enough to be almost completely silent. When watching again, we understand why he insisted. Without it, the film is only a tragedy. With it, the film becomes a lingering reminder that hope still exists, no matter how small and hopeless it is. 3. Bruce Dern was not the studio's choice. Few know that, at first, the studio wanted an actor with a warm, likeable look. the typical hero that audiences could easily sympathise with, so the film would sell better. But Douglas Trumbull insisted on choosing Dern for the opposite reason. He wanted the audience to look at Lowell and feel uneasy, not completely comfortable. Dern, with an angular face, sharp eyes, and an acting style that does not ask for sympathy, was the perfect choice to portray an ecological extremist willing to kill for his ideals. The studio worried that audiences would hate the character, even hate the film, but Trumbull believed that this discomfort was what gave weight to the message. Dern accepted the role with deep understanding. He did not try to make Lowell likeable, but kept the cold, dangerous exterior. The result was a complex character, both pitiable and frightening, making viewers question their own conscience. Many years later, Dern was still proud that he did not compromise. 2. Bruce Dern improvised the most painful silent scene in the film. Do you remember the most painful silent scene in Silent Running? When Freeman Lowell sits alone after the tragedy, saying nothing, only breathing heavily? That was a moment Bruce Dern completely improvised. There were no lines in the script, no detailed direction from Trumbull. He just sat there, eyes staring vacantly, heavy breathing, a haggard face drenched in loneliness and torment. The camera rolled continuously, capturing every small detail, chest heaving, hands trembling slightly, eyes lost in the vast space. Trumbull immediately recognized its power, deciding to keep it intact without cutting or adding effects. That scene needed no words to convey the pain. Silence was the strongest language. When re-watching, we feel the absolute isolation, artificial forest, drifting ship, and a man who has lost everything. It was the authenticity from Dern's improvisation that made that moment haunting for viewers. 1. Scientific prediction became reality. When the film was released in 1972, the idea of growing plants, maintaining a green forest in space was considered pure fantasy, a science fiction dream too far away, almost impossible to realise with the technology of that time. Freeman Lowell risked everything to protect Earth's last gardens by taking them into orbit, which sounded so romantic and illogical that many viewers saw it only as an artistic symbol, not a prediction of the future. But only 30 years later, science caught up and even surpassed that vision. Since 2014, the International Space Station, ISS, has started growing vegetables successfully. Lettuce, watercress, cherry tomatoes, even peppers, all grow in a zero-gravity environment under special LED lights. Astronauts not only eat self-grown vegetables but also study how plants adapt to space, from absorbing CO2 to growth cycles. NASA and other agencies have seriously discussed orbital seed banks, seed storage vaults in orbit or on the Moon to protect Earth's biodiversity from global disasters, exactly like Lowell's flying forest idea. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share and subscribe so you won't miss our next videos. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. See you in the next video.